Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. My name is Wendy Mertens, and I am part of the MSM communications team. Well, welcome to you all to the online masterclass of Dr. Harald Sander. Harald is a professor of economics and international in economics. And before we start with the online masterclass, there are a few things that I would like to share with you. If you have a question, please make use of the Q&A functionality. Dr. Harald Sander will try to answer all your questions at the end of the masterclass during the Q&A live session. Furthermore, this online masterclass will be recorded and everybody will receive both the recording and the slides afterwards. And well, that's it from my side at this moment. And now I would like to hand over to Dr. Harald Sander.
Thank you very much, Wendy. It's my pleasure to have this webinar here today. Well, a short word about me. I'm with MSM now for more than 30 years, I must admit. And I've started here at MSM in the times when when everybody was enthusiastic about globalization and nobody expected geopolitical disruptions like we have today. Over the many years, when I worked as professor of international economics also at TH Cologne, but also then at MSM, I was always, interested in issues of international trade, globalization, deglobalization, and I think it's time actually to look at geopolitical disruptions that we encounter today and explore what they have in store for global business in the near and a distant future. So welcome to everybody here and to this webinar. And if I say geopolitics, you know that geopolitics is now actually shaping global business environment. We have the tension between Western countries and China, the war on Ukraine, the Middle East conflict, just intensifying these days, but also tensions between US and EU. There's an ambivalent role of the global South, a rising conflict between democratic and autocratic system. And all that raises the question, are we facing a risk of global fragmentation, that this global society breaks into blocks or different blocks and the question begs the question, how to navigate as a company, as a global business in this environment. I looked up here one geopolitical risk indicator that recently, as you can see, has increased drastically. Everybody knows why. Global trade protectionism, US-China competition, global technology decoupling. By likelihood, Middle East, I think regional war should now go up. But this is how the days are. You can't actually, project from today what will happen tomorrow, and this, of course, has a serious impact on global business because planning becomes increasingly difficult. I will focus here, however, basically on the increasing protectionism and the US-China conflict. Protectionism, you have seen, that has basically increased dramatically, of course, with Trump's trade policies, tariff policies, but the trade conflict between US and China is already looming for a long time. So that is something that has almost become a regularity in international relationships nowadays. Looking at that, I ask a question here, what will happen in the near future? And when we talk about near future, we think about near future is basically what economists call the short run, where you have limited possibilities to adjust fully because you have already committed yourself, you have created a global value chain for your product. You cannot change that immediately. So you have limited adjustment policy. But apart from that, I would also like to look into the distant future, which may be a bleak future of global fragmentation, but it may also have possibilities for change and to adjust. And in a way, I didn't want to end today's webinar with a too negative picture, but also throw some lights of possibilities or new windows of opportunities that may come out of all this turmoil we are going through these days. What I will do is, after this introduction now, I will look at trade conflicts from three different perspectives first, or I put three different perspectives on the current trade conflicts, and use these perspectives then to analyze the competitive consequences in the near future. Before I go then to the distant future, to the threat, and to the windows of opportunities, before I will finally conclude. So let's start with geopolitics and trade conflict, three perspectives. One perspective is very simple. You can interpret the trade conflict that we are going through as a classic trade war. A classic trade war we know from the 1930s, when the US, the famous Smoot-Hawley tariffs, increased the tariffs to protect itself from competition, to fight unemployment at home. And in consequence, everybody else did that. And what we had was nicely presented in the so-called Kindleberger spiral. And this is how trade basically collapsed over a period of 3-4 years to almost nothing. So one interpretation is basically a classic trade war. A second interpretation is it's not simply about trade war or jobs and market shares. It's also a conflict about relatively power and dominance. So it's a political conflict. And this finally, as a consequence, might lead, and I think this is one of the biggest things that we witness now, and I will explain, that this will be a threat to the multilateral trading system as we know it today. And I will try to explain a little bit why that is important for global business and what can be done about it. Okay, let me come to the competitive consequences of geopolitics in the near future. So when you look at that, from history, trade tariffs was very high at the US tariffs. Then they went down, then they increased again. They decreased, and the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the 1930s moved here. And then we had basically the period, post-war period, finally with globalization as we know it, until here. And now we have tariffs, average tariffs of the US, which are higher than they were even in the 1930s. Right? So we have an extraordinary situation of extremely high tariffs, at least from the US side. And the question is, will others follow or not? So let's look at trade conflict as simple trade wars. Now, when you see trade conflicts, economists, and you will know that if you had ever a Econ 101 course, economists say trade is win-win. By trading, you enlarge the cake. You have more from everything because of efficiency gain. You produce the goods where they can best and most efficiently be produced, rather than growing bananas in Greenland, right? So that is, in a way, in a very simple thing. So there is a win-win situation. Now, once you have this win-win, once the cake is bigger, economists say, okay, then you distribute the cake. Well, this is basically a zero-sum game. If I get a bigger share of the cake, the rest of you get less cake. That's also clear. That depends a little bit basically on export-import prices. But economists say you won't do anything more than just the bottom line, so you won't be doing anything that puts you worse than before. However, inside economies, there will be winners, typically exporters who can expand their markets, and losers, those companies that are import competing. So we have a shrinking import industry, and workers lose the jobs in these industries. But economists typically are saying, okay, don't worry too much because the cake is bigger than the winner can compensate the losers. So much in theory. In reality, many things went wrong. The compensation for losers was rarely sufficient, and very prominently now is the recent study about the China shock in the US that led to severe income losses of workers in the US Rust Belt. The workers are simply not sufficiently mobile to move to California, and the steel worker is not easily becoming a programmer at Google and so on, and they are not sufficiently compensated. And what we learned from that is that this situation, we had the 1990s, everything was nice, but we didn't really thought enough about the social consequences. And that led to a globalization backlash already in the first Trump administration, but also Biden administration went for, let's do a foreign policy for the middle class. Let's do the Inflation Reduction Act to support industries. Let's do the SHIPS Act to support microelectronics. Let's do China policy to avoid more China shocks. And now with the second Trump administration, the focus is much more on protecting import competing old industries. Now, how do these tariffs work? I put on the right-hand side of the slide a typical graph that you may have seen in your econ course. Don't worry, I don't explain that. But for some, it may ring a bell. But basically what it says, when you put, say, on 20% US tariff on a final good, like an imported Korean Hyundai car, the US car makers is more competitive than before because Hyundai cars will now be relatively more expensive, maybe 20%. If Hyundai is willing to reduce the price, maybe less. But usually US car makers will win. The consumers will lose because the car prices increase. Governments like it because they have a tariff revenue. For the society, it's a loss because we don't buy the cheapest car or the most cars from the most efficient source. And what's sometimes forgotten about tariffs, when you support old industries, you take away resources from the successful industry, and you may also hurt your export industry that way. So that is a very, very classical analysis, but we now live in times where we have global value chains. That is, by the way, it's iPhone 3. I will later come to iPhone 16, where you can see iPhone 3 basically in 2008 or so was basically produced by components from Japan, Korea, Germany, US, and only assembling was done in China, contributing to $6.50 of the total cost of 178. Now, when you have global value chains are nowadays very, very complex networks. You see here a little network diagram that some researchers from the Bank of International Settlement produced nicely. But what you see is how connected things are. And what you must understand for the analysis that we do today is when you establish your global value chain, this is extremely costly. So firms are very reluctant because they are sunk cost to make adjustment when they see some shocks only as temporary. They say, okay, I don't know, maybe the tariffs go down tomorrow. They may not adjust at all. They only adjust when they see, okay, that may be a permanent change, and then they adjust their global value chains. Yeah? And that is important for what comes later as the analysis. But let's look first at what happens when you make a tariff on an imported input in the value chain. For example, you put a tariff on steel. What does that mean? It means that everybody who produces, say, cars in the US, maybe US producer, foreign, maybe Toyota in the US, faces higher cost for steel. And that means a win for Korea when it's still produced, for Hyundai when it's still producing in Korea. So it is actually the tariff on input goods can actually hurt your own industry. Huh? And this also means that US foreign companies have an incentive to shift production to third countries. And finally, you may do both. You may do a tariff on cars and a steel tariff. But then you have to look, is a tariff on steel exceeding the tariff on cars? If you have 50% on steel and 20% on cars, then the foreign producer will still win. Now, clever guys will say, okay, then do it the other way around. Let's have a higher tariff on cars and lower on steel. Yeah, but then you forget that already the cars are also inputs for other companies, for car rentals or companies with a large car fleet. So whatever you do, you're probably kicking just the can down the road. And now comes something which I think is probably most disturbing. Everybody knows the picture here that was on Liberation Day when President Trump presented his so-called reciprocal tariffs in the Rose Garden of the White House. And these tariffs are extremely complex what they are doing around the globe, and they make business environment absolutely uncertain. For example, just think about it. They have a different tariff, say, on Korea than on EU goods. If Koreans have a lower tariff than Europeans, then Hyundai gains relative to BMW. So it's not only that US is protected, but the whole competitiveness of companies around the globe is, turned upside down, is basically influenced by these tariffs if they're differentiated in that way. Likewise, when you put a tariff on imported inputs like steel, it depends pretty much where do US companies that use steel, where do they source from, right? So when they source from countries that have high reciprocal tariffs, they will lose more. So it's extremely complex. And to add to this complexity, currently when the US makes a tariff on certain goods, they override the reciprocal tariff. So everything gets really, really messy. And what economists like me do when they get messy, we make a little table to get a little bit of a structure in this. So when you have uniform tariffs, things are easy. Yeah, tariffs on final goods, home producer wins, foreign producer loses. On intermediate goods, home producer lose, foreigner wins. But with unequal reciprocal tariff, we have indirect effect, and these indirect effects lead to winners and losers depend outside the US. No? And likewise, when we have an intermediate product, at home there will always be a loss, but the loss depends a little bit on the sourcing you have. Now, to sum that up a little bit, reciprocal tariffs affect the competitiveness as a country in a direct way, but also in an indirect way as they change the relative position vis-a-vis other countries. So when you are a company, say in the Netherlands, you must not only be concerned about the tariffs the US has against the Netherlands, or in that case, it's basically against the EU, but you also have to look whether, Japan or Korea get a better deal or a worse deal, because that changes your relative competitive position vis-a-vis the US. And this, in a way, leads to some problems, especially from the point of view of making a deal. Imagine the following. EU has signed a deal, and then later UK makes another deal with the US and gets a better deal. That means the US companies worsens after the UK has signed the deal. Now, Europe may then be unhappy and say, okay, UK got a better deal, we want to renegotiate. Yeah, we want to get the same deal as they got. If you know that this has happened, all countries may have an incentive to wait and see what do the other get, and then say, okay, we want to have similar conditions to make sure we get the best deal. This, by the way, and I will come back to that, is why the multilateral trading system are treating all countries alike, so-called like the most favored country. Basically to avoid this situation of endless renegotiations or wait-and-see negotiation behavior. So in a way, this type of reciprocal tariffs can lead to endless cycles of negotiation, which increase and prolong uncertainty faced by companies worldwide. And this is the key word, uncertainty. What we have seen, and this is a graph by Geopolitical in X. This is one of the outstanding follower of trade policy. So he makes calculation what the effective tariff rate is, and he has to make recalculations now almost every day. And you see how it goes up and then down again and up and down again, and we are still much higher than we ever were. After all these actions. So we have a dramatic unpredictability. And this is where it comes in for companies. If it's unclear whether a tariff shock will stay or whether it will only be temporary, companies are not willing to reconfigure their supply chain. They will only do that when they see it's permanent. So it's basically they're holding back any kind of decision. And past experience has shown that they react to uncertainty by diversifying inputs, not by diversified input sourcing, but the only thing they do, they hardly do anything, but when they can reshore because they use robots, then they do. But for the rest, they do very little. They take a wait and see position. By the way, whatever is here linked in the slides that will be sent to you, you can click there and get the sources. So trade policy uncertainty has increased. Some guys are doing a trade policy uncertainty index. You see clearly how it went up recently, and but the guys who do that thing, they also studied the increase in trade policy uncertainty and really can also document in line what I said before. That is actually reducing investment, and by reducing investment, you reduce economic activity. So, to summarize that, what you see here is, as a consequence, economic growth has taken its toll. This is the first one here, is basically the red line, shows the projections that was made by the OECD for global GDP growth way back in December 24. And then we were already still very high. In March, the projection took a deep dive. And when we go back to the March 25 projection, global GDP growth even dipped much more severely. Just to show that by regions, I put here also from the OECD. This one is, or the black one is always the average between 2013 to 19 to have a benchmark. The world was along this benchmark in 23, 24, but the projections are now lower. For OECD country, we were doing a little bit worse, but the projection went down. For the US, in 23, 4, they did better than the average, but they went down dramatically. Euro area is doing a little bit better, but that's due to some other things that I will talk about later. And non-OECDs and non-rich countries also will take a certain toll. But interestingly, the US is obviously suffering quite substantially from that, according to this graph. So this begs the question, hey, can it be that trade conflicts lead to a lose-lose outcome instead of win-win outcomes? So that you get a smaller cake that way. And why should a country inflict pain on itself? Why should you hurt itself? For economists, that is non-understandable. So we stand before that and say, well, they should not do it. But for political scientists, they have an answer. And that is interesting. There's one guy, political scientist, representing the realistic school of international relations, John Mearsheimer, and he says big countries strive for relative power. So for them, it's not simply about being more powerful, but it's more important to be more powerful than your closest rival. And that brings an interesting idea. You may accept then even that you are worse off under the condition that the other is even more worse off, because then you are still relatively better, so that you do more harm to your rival than to yourself. That at least is what this school of thought is basically suggesting, and if it's so, probably some of the things may make more sense. Now, when we look into for example, in the US-China trade conflict of phase 1 with Trump's first administration and Biden, most study concludes that China was probably more severely affected than the US. So the realistic school of thought worked. However, today, it seems like China has successfully prepared for a second intensified trade war. It has developed its Made in China 2025 strategy, became much more independent of imports. It created access to more market by its Belt and Road initiatives. It has maintained its rare earth minerals dominance, and it's playing that card heavily in the current trade negotiation. And if you look here at the projections of the most recent projection by the World Bank on GDP growth, everybody who has here on the left-hand side of some bars, they make losses according to former forecasts. China not. So China may get well away with a trade conflict without being harmed. And that is, I think, an interesting thing. So it may well be that the strategy of relatively power play does not play out this time because China immunized itself so nicely. Okay. Now, relative power, I mean, one metric is that you look how big is my GDP. You sometimes get these things presented. And if you present, the GDP that you have, United States, EU, China, US is the biggest, but only if you take current US dollar. That is based on the strengths that we had in the past years of the US dollar. This may well be not forever. So an alternative to look at is actually to look at international or purchasing power dollars to see what economies actually produce, but evaluated at the same price of all goods. So that one burger costs the same in all countries. And when you see that, then China is already the biggest economy. If you put together, and we have some reapproachment between US and UK, so I put them just for illustration together, then even EU and UK is bigger than the United States. So we should take a note of that. Power play may be self-defeating as well. Finally, I would like to, on this one, to look at trade conflict as an attack on multilateral trade. I have already to look a little bit on the time. The multilateral system has two key elements, and one is non-discrimination. And that means all member countries must be treated alike. And this is actually where reciprocal tariffs go against. They treat all countries differently. And the second element is that it is rules-based. Once you have agreed on tariff, you stick with this, and that allows for predictability of global business and environment. Okay, let me say a few words how the system works. So a little bit on the art of a trade deal. This is the Director General of the WTO. Now, when you go into the hat of trade negotiators, policymakers are often a little bit mercantilist. They believe exports are good, imports are bad, but okay, if it's somehow balanced, it's okay. So what they do, economists would not agree with that, but they say, okay, balanced increase is okay. Anyway, you may think of a US trade negotiator going to China, say, hey guys, buy our cars. The Chinese said, oh, that hurts our car industry, but it's acceptable if you accept our clothing. So if they agree, if they make comparable concessions, then they may reach a deal, and both countries open the market. And that is the principle of reciprocity. And now something comes in the global trading system, and that's a most favored nation principle. If US accept clothing from China, it must do the same favor, the same tariff on clothing to all other countries. And China must accept cars from all other countries. But then China, of course, would say, okay, now we get cars from Malaysia. They should take our toys because it's reciprocity. And then Malaysia must import toys as well. And immediately what comes out of that is that you talk with all countries about all goods. And you do that in multi multilateral trading, so-called multilateral trading rounds. Here you see we have been talking about multilateral trade for a long time. First, they were not going very fast because Japan and Europe were still in the restructuring phase, so they were reluctant to open up. But from 1964 on, tariff reduction moved fast forward. So let's go here. But they did something very interesting, and that is a so-called formula approach. And what countries are then doing, they say, okay, maybe we reduce our average tariff from 8 to 6%. And then they go home to their and discuss with their industries, hey, would you accept more trade liberalization? Then do you need more tariffs, less tariffs? Until they come up with a package and present it. And then it will be renegotiated until this reciprocity is received. So you see, reciprocity means something very different. It's not that you have the same tariff or the same goods, or not the same tariff for every trading partner. It means that you have a tariff where you find, on average, it's okay. And this is where Trump's tariffs are really different. They create indirect competitive effects that disturb the whole global business environment and can lead to this endless renegotiation and delay. So let me think. So the multilateral system worked on these principles, and but already in Trump won, and Trump, for example, in the first administration, did not want new judges for conflict resolution at the WTO. China tariffs were not in line with WTO. Even Biden did not replace judges. He also did not abandon China tariffs. IRA, CHIPS Act, they're also doubtful in terms of WTO rules. Trump now has not appointed any new judges. There's no binding concession anymore, so it's everything is in flux and can be revoked anytime. And reciprocal tariffs are not reciprocal in that way. So the future of the multilateral trading system is in doubt, with increased uncertainty for global business in the longer and short term. So what we have is competitive consequences are harming global business strategies by complex changes of relative competitiveness and increasing uncertainty. Geopolitics aiming at relative power can actually downsize the economic pie, and the attack on multilateral principles amplifies basically both forces. However, new studies show that even when countries would strive for relative power, being better than the others, they can still adhere to the principle of multilateralism. Geopolitics and trade cooperation are only non-compatible, I quote, if rivalry eclipses any considerations of own countries' well-being. I think that is an interesting point. Otherwise, multilateral cooperation may still work. Okay, I see my time is running fast. Okay, I will come soon to my to the distant future. Okay, as I said, in the short run, there may be a number of losses because the flexibility is limited, and basically because companies cannot restructure their global value chain. We have talked about that. Global fragmentation is high, but also trade fragmentation is growing up. What does it mean, fragmentation? It depends. I found a study, and I have not updated it because it does not really make sense to update studies in a world where the situation changes so fast. You can run a study basically every hour. But what we know from these studies is the more you disrupt businesses, the greater is a long-term loss from global trade fragment, especially if it goes to reduced knowledge diffusion. If you go for technological decoupling, that's extremely negative effect. Emerging market developing economies, EMDEs, tend to be most at risk from trade and technology fragmentation. So the cost will be the higher, the more channels will be there. Okay, this will bring me finally to hopefully a little bit positive outlook. I have to make it now a little bit short, and I see Wendy already looking at the time. So in the longer term, we may be able to change a bit. The people might change their preferences. Companies may restructure their value chain. Countries may go into new trade relationships. So I want to go into 4 windows of opportunities. One thing is diverted demand. I mean, consumer decisions. Canadians buy now Canadian. So it's a business opportunity now for Canadian companies. China buys now soybeans from Brazil and Airbus from EU instead of Boeings. So there will be some change. And when there is a conflict that is considered to be permanent, and I think China, US will be permanent, whatever government is there, we have, for example, here the rise of connector states. Actually, what can be seen is that countries gaining market share in the US after they received a lot of imports from China. So China is using Mexico, China is using Vietnam, and a couple of other countries to go into these economies. So connector states win from that. Now, the second thing was, how will companies restructure their value chain? Interesting case study is the iPhone. Well, the US suggested maybe you can produce the iPhone fully in the US. Well, what is said here in Financial Times, that would cost you 3,500, but it's not the biggest issue. But the supply chain is so sophisticated and has such a strong focus on China and Asia that is almost impossible to do. And China, despite rising wages, is still the best place to assemble iPhone. Now, Tim Cook from Apple has basically suggested to use India. Is that a possibility? Have a look how the iPhone nowadays is produced. Basically, all inputs many inputs are basically coming from China. iPhone has 2,700 parts, 187 suppliers, 28 countries, less than 5% is made in the US. Assembling 85% in China, rest in India. If anything, if they go for India, maybe they can move a little bit of the parts. But if you want to exclude China, that will basically affect companies positively then in Southeast Asia that may take over that kind of business. Okay. Okay, 2 more minutes, Wendy.
Yes, and then we have to go to the questions because we already received some interesting ones.
Okay. Okay. That one is probably, I can make it short. There are other windows of opportunity. Climate change is one where companies can go in, especially now that US is basically going out of that. So I leave it here like this. Digitalization is another one. Especially in Europe, we have found that we are rather backward in IT and industries, but there is really an initiative to speed up digital development in Europe. And also digital economy may lead may lead to possibilities for technological leapfrogging in emerging markets and developing economies, digital services as an export industry. I have some recommendation here for reading, including a book that we edited here at MSM. Okay, a third thing is that third windows of opportunity, the dollar may be in decline, and maybe, I make it now short, a real contender could be the euro. It requires a lot, but interestingly, today in the Financial Times, ECB President Lagarde has an article on that. So also, this may change, and it matters for many countries because typically a stronger dollar goes hand in hand with tighter financial conditions. So there could be also a new window of opportunity coming up. Finally, and this, what we have seen, what are now the options? One option is the collapse of world trade. The second option is that we break up in hostile trade blocs. We can continue to model through making some regional agreements, largely adhering to multilateral rule, or we can probably go for a multilateral renaissance, and maybe some countries could be interested. European Union, Latin America, emerging markets, especially countries with little bargaining power, because then they have more power and they have more stable business environment. And China may also posit itself as a supporter, and global business as well. Results would be not probably the way it was the WTO we had, but probably a WTO that is less rigid, that adheres less to existing rules and norms, but that it can still try to establish predictability at the global level. Final word, we have gone through 3 decades after hyperglobalization, but now politics and geopolitics are back on the agenda. Global business needs to take geopolitics into account for daily work and for strategic decision-making. Geopolitics can trump economics, efficiency, and predictability, but this is not necessary if countries value the well-being of their own country and cooperate by taking measured steps to adapt multilateralism to the new realities. And after all, we live on one planet, and for that, global problems require global solutions. And the multilateral system has provided some good ideas for that and has served us pretty well over the past years. Thank you very much for your patience.
Okay, well, Harald, if you close off the presentation, you can go to the Q&A chat.
Yeah, I have.
And there are already people who, in total, we have now 10 questions. I'm not sure if you're able to answer all of them, but perhaps you can go through them and already make a first selection and just start answering the questions.
Okay, I have here Mark. Given the current situation regarding energy crisis, what does Germany views its political, economic, and international politics in the next 5 years, given the fact that economic advantage is only always part of the international image and gave the most favorite position in the, well, yeah, I think for Germany, I mean, the energy issue was always overriding because we became so dependent geopolitical on Russia. But I think by now everybody has understood that, and we are investing now massively in green transition. And I think, but not only isolated in Germany, but within the European context. And I think that is the one that it's not alone Germany, but we have to really look into the European context, because united we are stronger, especially in times of geopolitical conflict. Irfan has rising protectionist policies like reciprocity and tariff How can global firms plan long-term requirements when trade rules are content? Not at all. That is basically exactly my point. If you don't know if it's changing, and at any, just imagine, at some point in time, and that's my point, you made a deal, and tomorrow Japan gets a better deal. That means you, say, at Europe is suddenly worse off than Japan. So you cannot actually make really business decisions under these circumstances. And that's why companies, as I argued, are so reluctant, and that's why it's actually so damaging. Exactly, yeah. Urshikesh, is it possible to achieve a win-win situation in global trade, despite increasing complexity? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yes, I think the key argument again relies there that you have basically predictability. Predictability, and predictability comes really with treating all countries alike, because then you know how you make decision. And when you make decision, then you can put efficiency consideration there, and then basically the cake will enlarge. Mr. Anonymous, or Mrs. Anonymous, what would happen if countries attempted to mitigate the use of the US dollar when it comes to global trade? When global South suddenly refuse to purchase oil in US dollar? Well, I don't think that is at the moment is in any way possible, because oil is basically traded in US dollars. But the point I've made, and I had not enough time to discuss it, but please look at the slides and the sources given there. What we see is that the dollar is losing ground because investors get worried that is not the safe haven anymore. And if it's not the safe haven anymore, then there is room for another contender. I have not had the chance to talk too much about that. A contender can only be a currency where there is some democratic backup behind that, because everybody must be sure that the president cannot devalue the currency by his own will, but that there's a independent central bank behind that. So on that account, it is not the RMB. It can only be the euro, but that is difficult to achieve. If the euro, if Europe is courageous, there is some change that we get that we get another currency. Of course, you can, in the long term, think of other currency arrangement of an international currency instead of dollar and euro, but this is just another thing. What is the next one? What is the professor's opinion of BRICS? Is this good or bad for global trade? BRICS was first an idea of a hedge fund investor. It puts together very different countries with very different strengths and weaknesses. So it's not in itself a geopolitical factor. It's much more so it's nice for showing off, but it will actually not be very helpful for global trade. I think it would be much better if more developing countries were able to put together their voice, not only BRICS countries, but more developing countries, to have a stronger voice in international trade. And maybe the best forum for that is the multilateral one. And I was just reading a study where they actually arguing that smaller emerging market and developing economies should, be behind a multilateral initiative. I have here Masai. How can entities like the US remain strong and competitive? That's a debt issue. Yeah, because US it has an exorbitant privilege. US can buy whatever it can pay off its debts in own currency. And that's something that developing countries cannot. Nigeria cannot pay off its debt in naira. And South Africa most likely, to some extent, but very limited. But the US can do it with currency they print themselves, and this is really exorbitant. Okay. What is the most important challenge between geopolitics and supply chain? Actually, geopolitics, the way we see it nowadays, dramatically disrupt supply chain, but at the same time, they don't allow companies to effectively reconfigure their supply chain, because at the same time, it increases the uncertainty so dramatically. Okay. Qinjing Zhan said the EU just stopped high-level dialogue with China, while the US hit EU goods with heavy taxes, 50% metal, 25. Does it a dual presence signal a decisive shift towards confrontation? Signal, Can the EU succeed in becoming more self-reliant? That's a very, very complex question. So I don't know whether I can really answer that in short, but it's really a point that I think, just to put it like that, it's really a point where you see that reciprocal tariffs are, changing the landscape and putting countries from one day to another in a better or worse position, and you cannot really predict that. And I think the most important thing is really to do something here on the predictability, and this is a way, and maybe we can come back if the US is not willing to do that on a multilateral base, then that could probably be without. Enoch, I have will regional blocks work efficiently and effectively in this sense? Turning countries with having each country is having autonomy. Yeah, regional blocks. Regional blocks can do something, but regional blocks alone can also mean fragmentation, so that you trade within blocks. And we have a big, just think of, say, of an Asian bloc versus an Africa versus an European bloc. Asia is the center of microelectronics. So if you want to have just European or a North American regional bloc, you cut yourself off that knowledge. And as I've shown in that cost of fragmentation graph, that can be very costly.
I have to see the timing. I think we can only do one more question, and then unfortunately we have to close the online masterclass.
Okay. So I have next is Nick. What would a powerful country like the EU want? Why would it hurt smaller economies, especially those economies that are still in the crude stage, develop economically in order to create jobs for that teeming population? I frankly don't know, and I frankly don't know why that is so. There is no rationality behind that, and even they are doing not good for their own population. So it's basically doing harm on all sides. And why? There is no rational explanation for that. And that is, I think, the very sorry story of the current situation we are in, that we should need, and probably that as a final word, more rationality that we put in. I think both sides. We need in global business, we need predictability for global business, but we need also to have a close eye on the needs and aspiration of people. And in this way, I think we all, okay, it's a little bit last word, should work for a more just global trading system and hope that we'll be able to achieve that in the future. Thank you all for all your interesting questions. It was very exciting, and I would have loved to answer more, but we are through. Thank you, Wendy.
Yeah. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, Harald Sander, for this very interesting topic and for willing to provide your knowledge on this. As mentioned before, you will all receive the slide and the recording afterwards. And of course, we hope to welcome you again in one of our future online masterclasses. Thank you and goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you.